Thanks for coming to this session on decent work, or the lack of it, as the case studies I think will attest to, before and after COVID. So the kind of the overall framing for this session was thinking about essential work, foundational work before, during and after COVID, some of the specific challenges that have arisen, and the way in which different unions, activists, organisers, politicians have responded to those challenges. So that's really what we're here to discuss. Just a bit of background. My name is Matt Johnson, and along with Ava Herman and several of the people on this call who are collaborating with us, are working on a project called Decent Work in the City, which is comparing decent work initiatives in 6 cities around the world. So we'll be posting some things in the chat, so some links to the project, the cities that we're working in, and also some of the work that the contributors in this session are kind of actively engaged with. So forgive us if we kind of bombard you with things in the chat function, but the idea is to showcase what's already underway in each of our 6 cities. So we're looking at Manchester, Bremen, Montreal, New York, Seoul, and Buenos Aires. So a kind of real spread of cities, and looking at what's happening at that local level. So how are local actors kind of innovating, experimenting? How are they challenging precarious work? How are they organizing, building capacity? So it's a very kind of broad spectrum of activities, really. And the idea of this session really is to kind of reflect on some of the challenges around decent work, whether that's from an organizational point of view, whether it's building capacity amongst workers, whether it's kind of policy agendas, with a particular focus on essential workers. So we're looking at kind of transport, delivery workers, domestic workers in this session, but that's a big theme for the project, particularly around care work as well. That's kind of something that Ava and myself have quite a bit of experience on. The second aim of the session really is to bring together different voices. So this isn't designed to be a formal academic theoretical presentation. It's really kind of foregrounding the lived experience. So those people who are close to the detail, are involved in those campaigns, in those battles and strikes and campaigns on the front line, to kind of showcase what they've been involved in. And the third aim really is to facilitate some dialogue. So the idea is to try and get the speakers connecting to each other, but also to connect to the audience, hopefully stimulate some debate around the lessons that have been learned from these various campaigns, and how we can kind of sustain those into the future. So the contributors for this session, we have Lorena Poblete from National University of San Martin in Buenos Aires. We have Ian Allenson from Unite the Union in the UK. We have Ildelin Colon Hernandez from the Workers' Justice Project and Los Deliveristas Unidos in New York, who is working with Batt at Cornell. So I'll let people kind of introduce themselves a bit more once we get into the case studies. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Ava, who's going to give a bit of an overview of the project and what we've been doing in Greater Manchester.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. So basically, we have started piloting the project in Greater Manchester, and what we've done is 2 things. So the first thing we've done is we've created a collaboration with a women's organisation called GM for Women, which is an activist campaign organisation for women. And as part of that, we are organising small focus groups with women working in these key sectors to kind of find out how they define decent work. So that's in one side that is in process. And the other side is we have interviewed 13 key informants across Greater Manchester to find out what kind of decent work initiatives are happening, and also what the effect of COVID has been. So one key initiative that's come out, and what will be quite interesting to see how this compares to the other areas and other localities, is this notion of a good employment charter. So the mayor of Greater Manchester, together with trade unions, employers, and other state charitable charities and other state actors, has created a good employment charter, of which they've got 7 different elements. But key to it is having a living wage, having secure employment, and providing forms of voice at the workplace, even though trade union activism is really not there. And what is quite interesting is how this has been kind of created as a compromise between the unions and the employers with key areas of discussion, and how this is kind of a very voluntary mechanism and how they are trying to aim to promote it. So one way in which it's being promoted is through forms of social procurement, social value procurement, whereby if an actor wants to have a contract with the state, they can be a supporter saying that they're going to work towards these forms or elements of good employment. But so what is quite interesting and what we're trying to kind of figure out a little bit further is how it can kind of have two contradictory factors. So to some extent, it might cause it to be a flaw, as Ian will be talking about later, and about how this might actually encourage employers to reduce forms of quality of work, especially in public sector employment where standards of work may be better. But for other areas such as social care, actually this might be a way in which they could earn higher wages than they already are, not be on 0-hour contracts. So again, this is a very interesting initiative that we are starting to kind of have a look at and trying to kind of understand what is going on. So that's kind of where we are at with the project. But the aim is to kind of go further and look at different ways in which decent work initiatives are happening in these different cities, but also understand how different actors define decent work and see what is needed. And of course, share each other's experiences. So with that in mind, we had we have our first question for the speakers, and we kind of want to we will kind of want to find out what are the main challenges you face in your cities in organising for decent work, or creating forms of decent work. So we were just wondering if you could kind of highlight that, just give about 3 minutes just to explain that. Thank you. Shall we start with Ian?
Hi everyone. As it's quite a mix of people from different countries, probably worth just saying something about the general context in Britain. Obviously, the 80s saw some pretty major defeats for workers in big disputes, new anti-union legislation, and the establishment of kind of permanent unemployment at a level we haven't seen before, as well as reductions in welfare benefits, which intensified competition for jobs and drove more people into the labour market. One of the consequences of all that was union membership halving since 1979. The level of workplace organisation declined even more, though membership has stabilised in recent years. And the picture with strikes is even worse, with very, very low levels of strikes for over 30 years in Britain. So the result of all of that has been lots and lots of unorganised workplaces with little or no union presence. Employers being able to innovate in terms of ways of taking advantage of that situation, using outsourcing, casualisation, 0 hours contracts, and most workers reliant on individual rights that they lack the resources to enforce. So many employers attempt to comply with the legislation, but there's a big section at the bottom of the labour market where employers don't really make much of an attempt to comply, and there's very, very little enforcement. So turning to what's been kind of hot issues during COVID, I mean, most obviously safety has been a key issue. It's been a lot of action in both organised and unorganised workplaces of people just, at quite a micro level, confronting managers, we're not doing this if you don't do that, those kind of conversations going on, as well as some more visible struggles like in schools where school closures were forced by teacher union organisation in many cases. We've had a huge growth in the thing I'm going to talk about, which is fire and rehire, which is employers taking advantage of a loophole in the legislation to basically give notice of dismissal to a group of workers and then offer to rehire them on worse terms and conditions. The TUC estimates that over 10% of the workforce has been subject to that since the start of the pandemic, so it's extremely widespread. And then more recently, we've got the furlough scheme where the government subsidised employers to keep workers on when they weren't working normally. That's ending. So we're likely to see, we are seeing job losses at the same time as seeing labour shortages in some sectors, and at the same time that we're seeing universal credit, which is the main state benefit for people of working age being cut. Today, I think it is. In fact, it's being cut. And then another factor in the picture, I guess, in terms of resistance is inflation rising. So we're seeing considerably more conflict over pay, which seems to be a combination of COVID and Brexit combining to create shortages in particular sectors. And quite an interesting reaction from the Tory government, which is kind of welcoming this as a change to the labour market away from low pay. But in reality, it's very, very selective. So there are certain niche occupations where there are shortages and people are seeing very high pay increases. I mean, friends of mine working in hospitality talking about 20-30% increases in their pay rates, as well as the HGV drivers that have been more in the news. But many other low-paid workers not seeing that same change. So anyway, that's probably enough from me.
Thank you very much. Shall we go to New York now? Idalin, would you like to explain what's happening there?
I think the pandemic, I think Ian is right, have seen a shift. In New York, what we've seen is that the shift also have collided with the influence of technology in the workplace. The people that I represent are delivery workers that work for the apps called Uber, like in many countries, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub. So they have shifted. This is primary workers that lost their job during the pandemic shift to work on the applications or the apps. And that generated a whole shifting in terms of the work framework, the challenges, but also how the city will interact, right? Because you went from being an employer or an employee to being an employee, to totally shift to being independent contractors, right? Where the employer is not obligated to give you any sense of protection. So that is something that is shifted. And then I think the challenges that we see is that government is running far behind to interact with these interactions. Like I have said this many times, apps have been living in our cities for years, right? I have workers that we represent that have worked for the apps. I make this as a joke when they're not the cool thing to talk about, right? Like they've been working for them for 5, 6, 7 years. But cities have never kind of like try to bring the conversation about what's going to be the responsibility of the apps with the workers, with the consumers, with the cities. And that's something that in New York, at least Los Deliveristas basically took on just a couple of weeks ago. But I think that is one of the biggest challenges. It's the basic premise about how that relationship is going to work, where the responsibility is going to collide, and also how the worker will end in that spectrum of the reshifting of the interaction between employer, the city, customers, and everybody.
Brilliant, thank you. That is really, really interesting, really interesting. I think it's something we are seeing in Manchester kind of as well, and there's a massive debate happening. Lorena, would you like to tell us a bit about what's happening in Buenos Aires?
Hi. Yes, in Argentina for delivery workers, it seems something like this also, because they became more visible during the pandemic, and we started to ask in which way will we protect these workers, because there is not regulation for them. And concerning the case that I'm supposed to talk, domestic work and care work, it was a very important campaign when the Convention 189 was approved and when the local regulation was approved in 2013. And then Domestic Workers Union were very active in the campaigns of formalizing domestic work. And we still have troubles to achieve that, because only 25% of domestic workers are formal workers. And as we know, in this kind of relations in which everything is happened inside the employer's house, it's very difficult for the state to inspect working conditions, and we only have this indicator, formalization as the indication of a way to go to decent work or some kind of protected work. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw this workers' condition in a very precarious way, in the most precarious way. And when we see the statistics, we saw that most informal workers lost their job during the pandemic, and the state didn't give any, didn't make any policy to help domestic workers to keep their work. And because domestic workers, they are not allowed to unemployment benefits, most of them lost the salary, lost their incomes, and they couldn't return to work after the lockdown.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really, it's interesting. We're seeing kind of similar themes of inequality, precariousness in all of these different locations, and the interaction between the kind of long run challenges and the specific pressures of COVID. So I wonder if we could move next to then kind of a discussion of the campaigns and the activities that you've been involved in. So maybe Ian, if we could go to you first, if you could tell us a bit more about the Fire and Rehire campaign that you were involved in.
Yes, it's probably worth saying up front, I'm not a bus driver and wasn't directly involved in this strike. It's the same union I'm in. My involvement, though, was I'm involved in Manchester Trades Council, which is the kind of umbrella body for unions in the city. So we were involved in a lot of the organising of solidarity for the strike. So what I'm going to do is give a bit of background about the strike, a bit about the strike itself, and then end talking about some of the weaknesses and maybe some of the lessons that come out of that. So bus services in Britain were privatised, except in London, they were also deregulated in the 1980s. And the sector is now dominated by a small number of huge companies, mainly multinationals. Now, the Mayor of Greater Manchester plans to partially regulate services again with what's called a franchising model, where private companies operate franchises, which is basically the system that currently operates in London. So a lot of the bus operators, even ones that have got no background in Greater Manchester, are sniffing around, wanting to have some of the money when that happens. So the company in question, Go North West, runs the Queen's Road Depot in Manchester, and that provides services across Greater Manchester, particularly towards the north of the city region. It's part of the Go Ahead Group, which is based in England, but also runs services in Ireland, Norway, Germany, Singapore, and Australia. So quite a substantial company. The strike itself, there was a continuous strike from Sunday the 28th of February, and strikers returned to work Wednesday the 19th of May. So they were out for 80 days in total, which is an unusually long strike in Britain, and it's actually the longest bus strike there's ever been in Britain. So quite historic from that point of view. The most visible issue in the strike was about fire and rehire, that process of dismissing people and then offering them re-employment on worse terms, being used to impose cuts to pay and sick pay, changes to working patterns, and the marginalisation of the union and any future changes the company wanted to introduce. The kind of top level outcome was that Go Ahead promised never to use fire and rehire again anywhere in the world. So that was really trumpeted as a big win by Unite. The imposed contracts were declared void, basically torn up. Disciplinaries against a whole string of workers were dropped. Several workers who'd been dismissed were offered the opportunity to come back again. But the rest of the deal was a kind of compromise between concessions that Unite had offered from the outset of the dispute. Unite was offering to make a number of concessions to help the employer, and so it's a compromise between that on one hand and what the employer had tried to impose on the other. Now, at the time workers went back to work, it was seen as a win by those workers. I interviewed quite a number of them at the end of the strike, and they were having a bit of a celebration, but clearly they knew it wasn't a perfect win. And since then, as I'll come on to later, I think opinion has shifted quite a bit on what people think of the result. Because since the strike, the majority of the reps involved, the union reps involved in the dispute, have left. Most drivers now don't see it as a win, except in terms of defeating fire and rehire. And their perception is heavily covered by the fact that their own terms, what they're working under, are worse than they were before the strike, even though they are much better than what the employer was trying to impose. So my view is perhaps slightly more positive than most of the drivers now. I'd say it was an important partial defensive victory. So they didn't stop all of the attacks, but they are way better off than if they hadn't put up the amazing fight that they did. So a little bit about the strike itself. I mean, it had very impressive picket lines, really well equipped. There were marquees and toilets and an electricity generator. There was a choice of hot food and drink every day. And Unite was paying quite a high level of strike pay, £70 a day, to all the workers, which really helped sustain the action for that length of time. The employer Go North West didn't try to run services from the Queen's Road depot that was the heart of the strike. What they did was they moved services that they were trying to, scab services they were trying to run, to a place called the Haywood Distribution Centre just outside Manchester. So they had some of their managers and a few scabs running services from there, but they also subcontracted services to other bus and coach companies, some of whom used agency labour. And that was costing them a lot of money, over £1,000 a day they were having to pay for those subcontracted services. And for those not so familiar with the British anti-union laws, it's quite significant, that approach they took, because it's unlawful in Britain for workers to picket at sites other than their own place of work. So the employer was free to move work to other locations, and the workers were restricted from being able to picket them. And that meant there was quite an important role for community solidarity, which is the aspect I was involved in. So people did some of the traditional things, putting up posters and stickers, having marches and rallies and all those kind of things. But probably the thing that got most attention was staging community blockades of the depots, running scab services around Greater Manchester, but also on one occasion, one of the go-ahead depots in London, some supporters blockaded that as well. And it was quite interesting that the campaign was copying tactics from environmental campaigners, because when we initially started just walking up and down in front of the exits from these scab bus depots, the police objected that people were obstructing the highway. And there'd been some anti-fracking protests that had used the tactic of slow walking, so they would walk along a road extremely slowly in front of vehicles delivering equipment to fracking sites. And we copied that and did the same in front of buses. And typically we were able to hold up all the vehicles for maybe an hour just by walking slowly up single roads. Now, part of the other political context of this is that at the same time we've got the government trying to impose new legislation, the Police Crime Sentencing and Court Bill, which is intended to criminalise protesters doing things which are a nuisance. Which I always thought was the point of doing protests. So it'd be interesting to see if that legislation had come in, would the police have handled our actions quite differently? Certainly the bill's intended to allow the police to handle such situations very differently. One of the other things we had was the fact that this was in the middle of COVID. So for much of the strike, we were under restrictions, for part of it under lockdown, that banned gatherings, banned travel that wasn't for essential purposes. So the protests had to be organised, a lot of them in a very covert way. People were having to claim that they were taking their daily exercise outside the bus garage as an individual and just happened to be choosing to do it there. All those kind of ducking and diving. And people couldn't travel easily. So, you know, I certainly did more cycling during the strike than I've done for a long time, avoiding using public transport to get around or sharing vehicles. The third element of the dispute, alongside the strike and the community solidarity, was Unite conducted what they call a leverage campaign towards the end of the dispute. And that included trying to put pressure on the Mayor of Greater Manchester and also the one in London about franchising, saying that they shouldn't franchise to companies that were engaged in fire and rehire, but probably crucially in terms of getting the result of the dispute, threatening a mega contract for rail services in Sweden, where the Swedish unions raised concerns that it wouldn't be lawful over there. I mean, the strike did get quite heated. There was some quite nasty stuff in the media, you know, attacking the strikers, claiming they'd done all kinds of vandalism and threats and all this kind of thing. But on the other hand, the community supporters, we had buses driven at us by the scab companies, assaults on protesters and so on, which of course didn't make the news at all. So finally, I want to turn to perhaps some of the weaknesses and lessons from the dispute. So probably the first one I'd pick up on is the commitment. There was a kind of commitment to making the employer competitive that motivated Unite to offer concessions right from the start, which seems kind of odd when Unite's policy is formally to have public ownership of bus services. So you'd have thought seeing some of these companies go to the wall might be an opportunity to pick them up on the cheap, rather than seeing that as a threat. As I mentioned, the employer was able to move services to other locations, and Unite was unable to picket them lawfully, making it dependent on community support, which meant that the number of occasions on which blockades could be done was much more limited than if the strikers themselves had felt confident to do picketing. The lack of unionisation of many of the coach companies that were used as subcontractors, clearly highlighted by this. You know, the unions overwhelmingly concentrated on the service vehicles running the normal bus routes, not on coach companies, and that meant there was a big pool of vehicles and drivers available to try and provide scab services. There was a reliance by the strikers on the leverage campaign run by the union, by paid staff of the union, and that contributed to putting workers under enormous pressure to accept the deal. I mean, at the end, there was a lot of opposition to the deal. The vote on it was delayed by a few days when the union officials were trying to get it pushed through, because workers were just not willing to accept it. They had to tidy up a few more loose ends. It still it got through with a 78.5% yes vote, but a big part of the pressure for that yes vote was a lack of confidence by the workers that they would get that leverage campaign continuing if they had continued to strike. So the dependence on the official machine for that, rather than the workers doing the campaigning for themselves and using solidarity. Unite was quite conflicted over the pressure put on the Greater Manchester Mayor and the London Mayor. So we had a General Secretary election going on around the same time as the dispute, and one of the candidates was responsible for the leverage campaign that was putting the one who won, by the way, Sharon Graham, was responsible for the leverage campaign, putting pressure on the mayors. One of the other candidates was outspoken, saying this was wrong and we shouldn't be undermining the mayor's chance of being re-elected. There was no attempt whatsoever to encourage action in parallel at other bus depots. So there's quite a lot of legal restrictions around this. So you can't have a dispute over an issue that isn't your own. But there are things that Unite could and should have done, in my opinion. So it could have looked at other bus garages run by other companies in Greater Manchester and said, look, if you've got your own issue, now's the time to go for it. It would put massive pressure on the mayor. There's no scab vehicles left available and so on. Equally, they could have looked at other go-ahead depots across the country and said, what a time to have a fight over your own issue. None of that happened. And again, that left the workers at Queen's Road more isolated than was really necessary. And through quite a lot of the 8 days of the dispute, the union officials were focused on what were quite unproductive talks, which delayed the use of leverage and distracted from preparations to spread the action or reballot. I mean, I guess I want to end on probably a positive note, which is the networks of solidarity that grew around it. I think it's a very, very long time since we've seen anything like that in Manchester, and people are still in touch and still up for doing things for future disputes.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Ian. It's a really, really interesting story, and I'm sure it will generate lots of questions from the floor. I think maybe an interesting segue into hearing from Ildalin is that kind of ability to build solidarity among kind of disparate groups. How do you work with the media? How do you build kind of solidarity locally and nationally and internationally? And I guess the contours of those struggles may be shifting, you know, in this kind of modern era, particularly as we go through COVID. So I'll pass over to you now, Ildalin, if that's okay.
As I mentioned, we started this process about organizing and solidarity about a simple concept, and I know it will be crazy that I will say this in 2021. The simple concept was that workers will have, or were fighting for the right to use the restroom for the people that they deliver. In 2021, it's sad to say, in New York City, many of these workers during the pandemic and before the pandemic, as I said, they're not considered employees, but they're not considered customers. So restaurants have always used that kind of like trick to be like, well, I don't have to have access to a bathroom. So that was a simple issue that actually started to build solidarity normally among them, because it's fighting the basic principle of any human being. But also I think brought a lot of attention and solidarity through the press. There's a particular publication in New York City called The City. Two reporters, Claudia Irizarry and Josefa Velasquez, actually took this very personal, and they started to highlight this in the press, and it became national story, actually, that many of these workers were actually fighting for that basic right. We took that in as a way to kind of like use a way to, okay, how do we can start the conversation? Because I think Lorena highlight something before. There's a lot of workers that never have been seen, right? That they are unseen. Now they have become essential. The issues that they've been suffering, the conversation seems to shift it. So we use that concept not only to unite the workers, but also to unite and try to see how we can bring customers to our side, reporters to our side, and start the conversation about, okay, it's not only the bathroom, but it's also the pay. It's also kind of like the bathroom was the hooking. We hooked them in, just to kind of like follow up the conversations. We did pay. We did about tip transparency. Another big issue was about their safety on the street. A lot of the workers that we serve are usually victims of assault, as they want to, they steal their equipment. So that was a big issue. So the bathroom became that hook that got us in. And it started the conversation, because I think it triggered so many people to be like, wait a minute, you guys don't have access to the bathroom. Like, you get that person, that solidarity right there on the hook, because people cannot believe it and they don't want to do something about it. And that became national news. It helped us a lot to kind of like educate people about what was going on, educate a lot of issues. And then we took that opportunity in, and also to bring the city council, at least in New York City, to act on it. It's to like, okay, you have 65,000 of workers basically not having a bathroom, and the city council cannot stay quiet. So we kind of like put some legislation forward that we actually passed last week. It will be the first of its kind, at least in the United States, where local authorities have set working conditions for an industry that was totally unregulated, right? And we did a report also with Rosemary and Cornell to also kind of like find a way to be like, what a lot of workers and the apps will go back and be like, well, that's isolated issues, that isolated incidents. We actually put them into data. And the report that we did today was amazing, because it validated all the story from these workers. To be like, this is not an isolated situation. This is a systemic problem, right? 500 workers don't have access to a bathroom. 500 workers are earning less than $15 an hour, right? It kind of like gave that sense of validation, and also highlight some of the systemic problems that I said the city couldn't take away from it. And I think it's also what is being from us is taking advantage of, I would say, like, sometimes things come to you as an organizer and you have to take it on. New York City actually went to a hurricane. Hurricane Ida recently hit New York City. There's a viral picture of a delivery worker for Grubhub in the middle of the whole water up to his half of his body with a bike trying to pull through to make a delivery. Because while the hurricane was happening, we have all of our workers are actually working during the hurricane. The city and the mayor of New York is saying to people, go home, go home, go home, because it was getting historic flood across the board. And the apps from on the other side are telling workers and incentivize workers to pay them $1 more or just $1 for delivery to keep them out. So there is a famous picture that went viral, made the New York Times, we're across the whole world. And it's actually and it's interesting because it's a photographer that actually focus on inequality. So he takes this picture and he takes this video, and that helped us so much, because then to be like, this is once again as to why New York City and the authorities have to intervene in a totally unregulated industry. This is happening in front of everybody. In bathroom was just kind of like, now we have more concerns, right? Because they put him at risk. So it's kind of like we've been using that as a way to turn to solidarity. And as I said, it's been so helpful, because when you see, I tell people in the bathroom, when you see that picture, you get customers to be like, okay, wait a minute. Like, I have to kind of like figure out how to get there. And part of this unique organizing that I think we're dealing with, we're only organizing workers. We also have to organize the customers, because the customers can easily turn positive or negative. California approved, right? They lost the organizing of Uber drivers in California because companies were able to turn customers against the workers, right? So we've been very conscious about that dynamic. So we're not only organizing workers, but also we only organizing the consumers. So we've been using about that solidarity. How do we can bring the consumer in another type of solidarity, kind of like giving them the space to, yes, keep using the app, but be conscious about what's going on and how they can kind of like figure out how to participate. And this is just the beginning, as we're able to set some basic legislation. And there's more actions to come for sure.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Lillian. It's a really fascinating story, and like you say, it's about the kind of fight for visibility, isn't it? Just recognizing that these people are there, they're working, they're out there, they're kind of facing all these challenges, and they still don't have basic kind of, dignified human kind of relationships with the people they're delivering to or the people they're working for. So, just to kind of put that on the map and get that recognized is really important, which I think hopefully, Rose, did you want to jump in at all? Or?
Yeah, I just want to make one comment. This is some of the most innovative work that's been going on in the U.S. And I think one of the really important things we could discuss in relation to the Manchester and the New York case, and probably the Buenos Aires case, is the issue of sectoral wide organizing, right? If you do company by company, we've learned that, you can't. But if there's mass organizing at a city level and going after, multiple constituencies to gain their support, then there's more a possibility. And so I think that this is a very powerful lesson. It's powerful just because of the way workers have been so poorly treated and how desperately we need them. And I know when I've been in New York City driving, I think people on the road often get angry at the delivery people because they're weaving in and out on their bikes. And you're saying, and so there's an image about a kind of set of careless drivers, but they're forced to drive so quickly that, then the drivers are not necessarily supporting them. And so you have to work to overcome that as well. And so I think there are these multiple layers to look at in these two cases that will be wonderful to talk about in the discussion and when we bring in the third case.
Perfect. Thanks, Rose. Yeah, I think that kind of segues us very nicely into to the case from Lorena.
Just commenting in what Rosemary said, exactly in Argentina, in Buenos Aires in particular, we saw kind of the opposite process, because about delivery workers, app delivery workers, and domestic workers, we can see a big fragmentation in unions. Delivery workers in the city, they have three groups. They are not recognized, officially recognized as union, and they couldn't engage together and with the big workers unions or confederation, workers confederation, to build a movement in recognition of their rights. Even though during the COVID pandemic they were a key actor, they couldn't build this movement around the recognition of their rights. And it's the same for domestic workers or care workers, because the union is a recognized, officially recognized union. And at the beginning, before the pandemic, after the new law was passed in 2013, they started to organize and collaborate with the ILO in different campaigns for local domestic workers and also for migrant domestic workers, because the city of Buenos Aires received a lot of migrant domestic workers from particularly Paraguay, but other neighbor countries. And but the position also within the unions, ILO, and the government was to consider decent work is like a synonym of formal work, and it's a very normative approach of decent work. And we can consider that because it's difficult to inspect the real labor conditions, it's kind of the only imaginable approach. And we have a lot of campaigns around that, around formalization. Some of them were very interested because they were kind of trying to circumvent the impossibility to get into the employer home, and there were inspections around the countries or buildings, and there was a mix between inspection and information for domestic workers to consider to inform them about their rights. And these kind of campaigns were focused on the higher income levels employers. And now the government decided to start a new policy of formalization of lower income employers, because they consider that this is the main problem, informal work for fewer hours in low income household. And now the government decided to subsidize between 30 and 70% of the domestic worker's salary during 6 months if the employer formalized the domestic worker. And when I'm saying that it was a very normative approach and we are kind of following this tradition, we saw also within the domestic workers unions and groups, because there are some Facebook groups that are not exactly related with the union, but they are very active in a campaign about the protocols of COVID pandemic, because they feel that they wasn't protected enough, that the idea was that they have to take care about others, but nobody take care about them. And the government didn't respond to that. It was a very broad protocol for all workers without considering which are the risks that domestic workers encounter within the employer household. And it's not a very happy story. It's more like a sad story, because domestic workers are very they have very difficulties to be considered as workers and to be recognized as entitled to rights.
Thank you, Lorena. Yeah, it's really, really interesting, and kind of another way in which COVID has kind of shone a light on some of these issues that have been there for years and years, but it's really kind of brought it to the fore, I think, hasn't it? So I guess the next part of the discussion, I was hoping to get your reflections from all of you, but really is, what kind of lessons do you think either you or the organisation or the campaign has taken from these kind of initial activities? What's changed? What do you hope to see in future that might kind of set this on a more sustainable footing, or might expand out, like Rose says, to entire sectors, or thinking kind of across the whole city? How do we kind of build and sustain the momentum? How do we kind of link and build solidarity with other networks and other organisations? So maybe if I can come back to you first, Ian, if that's okay.
Sure, and I just wanted to pick up slightly on something Hilda Lynn said about access to toilets being such a central issue, because that was an issue in the bus strike as well, but not one the workers or the union foregrounded at all, because one of the issues was they're wanting to change linear routes for 2.5 hours into circular routes of 5 hours without getting out of your seat driving a bus, which obviously generates some health problems. But it's interesting that they didn't foreground that. You know, they talk about it if you were there on the picket line, but it wasn't something they foregrounded. Maybe they should. In terms of the lessons, I did talk about some of them at the end of what I said before, but picking up a few things. I mean, the change in Unite leadership, one of the key things the new General Secretary is advocating is the creation and the strengthening of what in our jargon we call industrial combines, which are basically bringing together reps from across industrial sectors or particular companies. Clearly that would have been a huge help in the disputes, to have had that a stronger culture of a kind of sectoral or industrial approach towards it, which is kind of what Rose was mentioning. I guess one of the things that's pushing against that slightly is that we've seen it, some industries like the National Health Service in Britain, which have had sectoral level bargaining, but where workplace organisation has really been hollowed out as a result, and where people are now struggling to get good turnouts in ballots and things like that, which we now have to have under the law. One of the lessons I certainly know that some of the leverage team have learned is that it was a mistake to stop the leverage when fire and rehire was dropped. So that was used as a kind of a trump card to stop this outrageous behaviour of fire and rehire. But then when it was stopped, that still allowed the employer to try to negotiate most of the content of what they were trying to implement through fire and rehire. So that it should have continued until it was settled, and that would have sent an even stronger message to other employers: don't do this because you'll be punished for doing it, rather than just stop from doing this. A lot of the people involved in the community solidarity have learned the lesson that though the blockades were really welcomed by the strikers, and they definitely cost the company money and bad press, agitation at other garages was strategically more important. That actually, had we spent some of that time going leafleting other garages, that might have had more impact overall on the dispute. There's a political question about the fact the campaign failed to move the Greater Manchester Mayor, though he did support the strike, he said, but did not meet their demands to commit to not using companies that used fire and rehire. And it links to something Eva raised at the start about this minimum standards across Greater Manchester that he's proposing, which is that minimum standard is lower than what most workers in the bus sector have already won. So they're looking for something sector specific that reflects the terms that they've won and avoids a race to the bottom in that sector. So that's an interesting question. One of the big positives, I think, was, I mentioned it couldn't have gone on for that long, I don't think, without the Unite Strike Fund, which is currently, I think, over £40 million. And that's been absolutely crucial to sustained action to give that good level of strike pay. Of course, that can't scale to include a large percentage of members, and it's less applicable in unions that are more concentrated in a single industry. So because Unite's quite a general union, it works quite well for Unite. But if unions organising in one industry did it where half the members were out at the same time, they'd burn through the strike fund in no time at all. And the last thing I mentioned about the community solidarity networks having continued, but I mean, there's been some discussion as well. There were quite a few climate campaigners from Extinction Rebellion and other organisations involved in that, and they're actually talking about trying to strengthen that link and do systematic strike solidarity from climate campaigners, which personally I think, if we're going to have success over tackling climate change, that kind of convergence between the workers' movement and the climate movement is a very exciting prospect. So I think that's something quite exciting coming out of it.
Yeah, I guess the kind of the flexibility and the adaptation of campaigning and organising strategies across different issues is becoming quite central to the debate. I guess maybe a bridge to the New York story maybe is around the role of local legislation. I get in the UK it's very limited. The city mayor, the local authority have very few municipal laws that they can enact or enforce, so it's done largely through kind of persuasion and cooperation and soft negotiation. I guess the situation perhaps in New York is slightly different, where there is legislation you can point to as a result of this campaign. I wonder if Ildelin or Rose, whether you want to offer some thoughts on the strengths and limitations of that kind of legalistic route, whether that's enough or is that a platform to kind of broader discussions?
So it's interesting because we demanded city influence because to maneuver. Actually, it's interesting because the companies try to put in a state bill that we actually hold. It was about to do like a last minute session, kind of like behind closed door with other unions. And we actually shut it down. We're like, we're not supporting this. We're not being at the table. And I think also that gives some strength. And it's interesting that the state bill that they were trying to propose was actually take the capabilities to issue city regulations. And we're like, that's something that we're not going to support. Doesn't make no sense because cities can decide to have minimum wage or better conditions for their people. So I think the challenge was the city. I think the city has a very interesting conversation, right? Because the city provides a framework, which I think we needed in this case. But I think it's also start the conversation about do is not enough, that they don't go too far. Doesn't address, right? Like at least in New York City, in the United States, there are state issues and then city issues. Doesn't matter how city issues compel, the state has to intervene, which I think it's trigger. But I think it's also trigger other conversations, right? At this move forward, a lot of people have walked up into it and they have like 20 ideas how to deal with this industry. And it's very scary because you have a lot of people that want to jump in that have no idea about the industry and can put workers in a worse condition that they were. And we're starting to see that. We started a lot of people to be like, I have an idea how to address the issue of bike stolen. And we register everybody. I'll be like, no, that's not a way to do it. You have undocumented workers that don't believe in that system, right? That are very afraid of it. The government agencies don't have the capacity to actually register people that we already have. So I think that has been one of the lessons that we're trying to figure out too. Now we have all these people get very excited to be like, I have 20 ideas, but they have never speak to the workers. and also what is interesting that we're starting to notice too is as you do regulation, companies, new corporate interests start to flourish, right? we have an experience of that, right? With the issue about securing bikes, now we have corporations reaching out to be like, well, insurance companies are, I'm telling you, they're very happy because if that goes through, that means 65,000 people have to buy insurance. So we have to be very careful about that. We have to be very careful how regulation takes place. We also have to make sure that regulation is effective, right? We put forward 6 bills, but now our whole effort is about implementation, right? And education, because we have a lot of people that have rights, but if they don't know what the rights are and what happened when they violate it, what's the point of passing a law, right? So I think it's something that we have to really focus on, because I think we go to legislating a lot, but legislation is just a tool. But if the tool, people are not using that tool, what's the point of it? So I think it's a lot of back and forth about how are we going to do this, and also the state challenge, at least in here, and it's a very fundamental concept. Do people want to be employees or not? That is what the center are right now at the discussion that we are involved, right? Like half of the people will say, well, there's employees or nothing. Some of these workers will tell you they don't want to be employees. So that is a very carefully discussion that we have to do. How do we move forward? But also have to make sure whatever this group and our workers are deciding cannot impact negatively other groups that they already have fought for center rights. So it has to be done very specifically. So as many of our workers, I will say, we're moving forward, but we're doing slowly. We're not rushing to things. And I think that is also the key. I think the momentum can get you to rush to many of the groups because you have the momentum, but something rushing is not like the greatest strength when it comes to this.
I'd just like to add something about the U.S. before we bring in Argentina, and that is specific maybe to the U.S. is that our federal system, our national system doesn't work, right? We have deadlock at the national level, and so historically, when we've had this kind of problem, we have used cities for sites of experimentation. And we pilot innovative things. And this goes back to J.R. Commons in the 1920s, identifying policies at the local level and proving them, and then moving them up the ladder. And much of the New Deal legislation of the 1930s was the result of local experimentation. So we have a very federal system. And given the complete breakdown in national labor laws, enforcement of those laws, et cetera, we've really moved to this local level. And an example for it certainly is the fast food movement, the Fight for 15, which, exploded, right? It was proved in one location, then in others. And in the space of about 4 years, we probably increased the wages by 50% of 25 million workers in the United States because it bubbled up, went from the local to the state, et cetera. Now, this was the most successful example, and they didn't get union rights, which is the big failing people point to, but people really benefited in their lives. So I think that's the kind of direction a lot of the labor movement is going in the United States in this social movement. And let me just point out the ILR Review, which is the journal that I edit, just came out with this month a special issue on what we call the new federalism. And it gives all sorts of examples of how these experiments are working. Not, the Uber drivers, Seattle versus New York, and the paid sick leave, scheduling, advanced scheduling legislation, lots of different experiments. And I'm going to put that in the chat. And now I'd love to pass it to Lorena.
Thank you. Well, for us, it's kind of the same. Labor laws, it's a matter of national jurisdiction, but the implementation is a local and state jurisdiction. And but the city of Buenos Aires is very peculiar because it's the main city and it's the capital, and it's kind of a synonym of the country, even though things happen differently in the rest of the country. And we here we have kind of the same situation that Heidelin described about domestic work, because we were very focused on the regulation and to put the better law possible. But there is a very important work to do in conscientization, information. And even though we had this kind of campaigns after the approval of the new law, we need to change, make a cultural change about the perception of paid domestic work, particularly in a country in which, as you know, social inequality is very high, and for people of upper classes to have a domestic work is kind of have someone who serve in the house, not a worker, kind of a help, part of the family, all this stuff that the literature talk from centuries. And it's an important to have regular campaigns, reminding people that it's a work subject to rights, and also for domestic workers to have tools to claim the rights. This is kind of something important. And concerning delivery workers, we have the same situation as you described in New York. Delivery workers didn't want to be employees completely. They have to have some freedom to choose how to work, when to work, but with the protections that the status of wage employee give them. And it's a very ambiguous position, because delivery workers didn't want the proposal that legislature made about the future law concerning the sector. But we don't have a much advancement in this area right now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lorena. I think it's kind of poses some interesting questions, isn't it, about the future of organising in these very kind of low-paid, precarious sectors where you've got multiple sources of exploitation, vulnerability. How do people kind of build capacity, whether that comes from campaigning or does it come from the ground up? So I think with the time that we've got left, I'd like to kind of throw it open to members of the audience to jump in with any questions, or if not, Ava might have some in backup if people don't come forward immediately. I'm not quite sure how it works on this platform. I think you have to post a question in the Q&A first, and then we validate it, and then we can turn your camera on. It's a slightly convoluted process. I don't know if Ava, do you want to kind of add anything, or do you want to?
Well, yeah, I can ask a question.
Yeah.
So I just had a question for each one of you. And what do you think is the most useful way to build solidarities between different actors, both within the cities but also internationally? Idalin, do you want to start? How did you guys build your network? How did you build up solidarities with different people? What was the most important way to do that? Wait a second, I can't hear you. Don't worry. Shall we go? Oh. Lorena, do you want to add something? We'll see if it works.
Well, in the case of paid domestic workers, it was a very big movement that it was documented by Adele Blackett, Ellen Boris, and Jennifer Fish, about how the movement was built from the ground and arrived to the ILO to produce this convention, and then how the movement worked in the approval of national labor laws and the implementation. And it's a very interesting experience to understand that for example, delivery workers, at delivery workers, we can imagine something like this, and workers that are marginalized and workers that, in the case of domestic workers who work as isolated in a household, were able to build a movement from the ground, go to the ILO, and then following with the movement, following the movement at the local level. I think it's a good example of that.
Ian, have you got any ideas on how best to build these solidarity movements? Because I know that the Manchester Trades Council has been doing quite a lot, and you mentioned also the creation, the interrelationship between the environmental movement and you guys.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite unusual in the sense that when I've done strike solidarity before, you do that in a very open, public way, but because of the legal position with the COVID lockdown, we weren't able to do that. So it relied very much on people's personal networks. So we were kind of adding people into the group when somebody kind of vouched for them, that kind of approach, rather than making public calls for this or that to happen. And that was quite interesting, because what it revealed or used, I suppose, was quite a wide variety of existing political and campaigning groups that existed in the city that didn't typically work together that closely, but that people knew each other through these different networks, and then people go, oh, this is good. I'll ask that person who I know through that group or whatever. So it kind of grew through a wide variety of existing networks. And I think the other thing that was quite interesting was that a number of people involved had never really been involved around a strike before. And, you know, who were kind of exposed to this whole kind of arena of trade union politics and kind of the dynamics of a strike and what you could and couldn't do lawfully, and when you wanted to break the law, and, you know, those kind of questions. So it was I think the process of doing it would be what I'd put at the centre of it, is that you can talk about solidarity, but you build the networks by using them, by attempting to do something. And I think that goes for, you know, in less unusual times as well. You know, one of the things that I'm keen on doing when there's strikes is physically taking strikers around different workplaces to talk to people in those workplaces, because, you know, you can send out as many emails as you like, but, you know, meeting somebody face to face who says this is what we're going through. And obviously we weren't able to do that during this strike because of the COVID rules. You know, you'd never get past reception in most workplaces or past the gate. But doing it, I think, is the best way to build it.
Thank you very much. Idalin, do you have do you have anything to add?
I think you're still on mute, Idalin. The promise and pitfalls of modern technology. I don't know. Rose, do you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to say, I can't speak from on the ground, because unfortunately I haven't been on the ground in since my days as a union organizer for 1199. But there is a question from Gregor in the questions, so we could go and ask that. And it looks like Idalene logged off and is going to come back on.
Yeah, sure, no worries. Yeah, so I think it's kind of along the lines of what we've been discussing about where do we scale these campaigns? Are they always likely to stay, and are they best suited to staying local, reflective of particular communities, particular workplaces, and so on? Or should we be always looking to broaden them out, scaling them up, bringing in kind of higher level actors? What do people see as being the kind of the most sustainable and the most effective ways to go with that? I don't know whether Ian, if you wanted to jump on that one. We've been saying before.
In terms of the question, so is it outwards, upwards, downwards, context specific? I guess what's most important probably does depend on the situation. So I can see that if you're trying to organise workers who are relatively easy to replace by quite a large pool of people in a geographical area, you need to have a very strong geographical focus on organising kind of everybody in that area. Whereas I think for an occupation like bus driving, obviously you need a license, and so there's a kind of a known pool of people who are potentially involved in it. And I think in that context, I think the scaling outwards is the thing that would make the biggest difference. The construction of these combines in terms of the workers themselves, and then I think locally trying to focus on building solidarity networks, which are I think typically local and can then be used for a variety of different disputes rather than just one. I mean, I think upwards is quite problematic. I mean, as I've illustrated, I hope that sometimes there's kind of pressure from above to accept something that really doesn't do the workers justice, or takes for granted things that perhaps the workers might want to challenge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Idalene, can you get in yet?
Oh.
Can you hear me? No, sorry about that. Can you repeat the question for me? Sorry.
Yeah, well, it was a kind of a twofold question about kind of building solidarity, but then also the scale at which building networks and building campaigns is most effective. Should we be looking at kind of hyper-localized campaigns, very rooted in communities and specific contexts, or should we be looking at building connections with other movements across cities, up to the national level, up to the international level? Where do you see the kind of future of that organising work going?
I think, at least for the delivery workers, as I said, it's a very interesting organizing, because you don't have to organize. We're organizing workers, but also we're organizing consumers. But I think I think for how Rosemary highlight in the U.S., the hyperlocal model will have worked because our federal system is not working. So you can accomplish some local wins that can start that movement to get on a bigger spectrum. I think right now in the apps world, we starting to talk to other cities that are trying or want to do this kind of like approach in order to bring some legislation. We actually learned from Seattle. Was the first city that tried to regulate the apps industry. We learned a lot. We talked to them. We got some ideas, what worked, what didn't work. I think also our workers are starting to encounter that movement in their own countries are starting to do this. For example, we do have a lot of immigrant workers from Mexico, and actually they were in a conversation with a similar group in Mexico that is trying to organize app delivery workers, right? For them, it was very surprising to be like, wait, I left there, end up here in the United States actually organizing, but I'm meeting people from my same hometown that are trying to do this. So how we can do that? But I think for us, hyper-local organization is very powerful, especially New York City. New York City has a great impact, not only at the local level, at the state level. It's the big city that can push the state to move in one direction because of the amount of people and amount of voters, amount of political capital that they have. But I think it's also hyper-local has to be across workers. For example, one of the greatest things about this organizing campaign is that we have huge workers from Latin America, Bangladesh, Africa, all do this work. And sometimes we have them in like one corner, but they don't talk to each other. So we started to break those barriers, and that's where we focus hyperlocal, starting to break those barriers to work together. Actually, fatalities among delivery workers is really high in New York City. We have 17 in less than a year and a half, all of them doing work. And what have generated that is that we feel solidarity with the other communities, and we started to break those barriers to talk together. And as we do that, it's interesting that how much we have learned, or the workers have learned, how much they have in common. For example, a lot of people from Bangladesh, in order to get to America, to the United States, travel through Latin America to come up north. So many of them, like they will tell them, I have one worker actually, Bangladesh, he speaks English, Spanish, and he surprised all the Spanish workers. And he said, yeah, because I spent 2 months in Bolivia actually trying to come up to. So I think that has started to generate a solidarity, and then you bring other peoples, right? Because we never encounter, now the Bangladesh community, there's a lot of community groups in New York City that they know us because of that interaction. So we started to kind of like go into to other communities, and I think that's the best validator, right? Because you coming in from the community itself to their own community, introduces, you get their trust, they get you into the community, they get you the conversation that helps you. And I think that has been very powerful for the workers and also for the consumers, right? So as we break those barriers, they're starting to see that. And I will tell you, we do have a logo. I don't have it, but this is like the shirt that workers wear. This is what they designed. They came up with themselves. And it's interesting because in New York City, workers, they have the sticker or the organization on their bikes. So many workers will tell me when they go to places that customers is like, I don't speak English, but he give me the thumbs up. So even that small thumbs up from a person that recognizes him in the street, you see that solidarity start to break, right? Like it start to generate it. And it having a huge campaign, it's just having a sticker, and for them to wear it very proudly, and from the other side to recognize it. But it's like many of the workers will tell me, I get a lot of thumbs up from people. I get a lot of thumbs up from other workers. Actually, recently, one of our workers sent me a picture. He was very proud. He was going into the delivery, and then he saw a poster from the Transportation Union, TW, Transportation Workers Union International, in their in the door of their houses that says, I support los delivery workers. He was like beyond himself.
Well, we really learned from her. I would just like to quickly say, I don't want to take time from Lorena, but one of the key things that is totally on the opposite end is who's going to pay the money to scale up. And that, there's so much, of course, you can do on the ground, but then if you want to go to the next level, and in the Fight for 15, it was the SEIU who spent, some people estimate, 30, 40 million over a series of years and got so far, but then the union couldn't sustain that. And so we have seen a kind of plateauing. And now to get to the next level, it's like, you've got to start a membership organization, right? You've got to start something. We get foundation funding as well. But so I think that's the kind of other piece when you're talking about getting to scale. It's not nearly as interesting, but it's really important. So I'll turn it to Lorena.
Yeah.
You're back on mute, Lorena, sorry.
Rosemary, I think that you just highlight the key point in scaling the organizing, but also I will think about the structures already in place, because for the movement of paid domestic workers, they were, at least in Latin America, a very old confederation of unions that started at the end of the 80s, in 1988. And all this infrastructure in terms of links between unions, national unions, confederation, or unions within the different countries. That's give a starting point to scaling up, and obviously with the help of international non-profit organization and also very big international workers unions that help domestic workers to get into the ILO and kind of give this movement the happy ending that we wait for, that it was the convention. But yeah, this is a key point also. Infrastructure and money.
I think also the point about the kind of the fragmentation on the employer side is a huge part of the story, isn't it? Whether it's the restaurants or the franchise system in fast food, whether it's domestic workers, whether it's the kind of fragmentation of transportation in the UK. How do you, it's not just organising the workers, is it? It's organising on the kind of business side. How do you speak to them in a kind of coordinated way? I mean, we're kind of getting towards the end now. I don't know whether Ildelinda was the punchline to the story was still coming when you when your connection went down. I don't know if you wanted to add any more or not.
I think I added a lot. Sorry about the technical issues.
Not a problem at all. I think we've done well to get people from time zones all over the world in the same spaces. Has been great. It's been really interesting to hear all of your stories. I think the kind of commonality as well of the challenges across different sectors, different cities, different countries, different kind of regimes is really fascinating and quite telling, I think, isn't it? That these sectors have been kind of ignored. They've not been visible. They've not been recognized. They've not had a kind of voice in many ways, and that's obviously what everybody here is involved in, is kind of elevating and giving visibility to those most kind of vulnerable and precarious workers. And I think that's an important message for us to kind of take away from this, and something that we want to kind of pursue through the rest of the project. So it's really been great to hear all that, and also to kind of get you kind of bouncing off each other. I think it's been a great session. So just remains to say thank you for your contributions. Thank you for your participation. I hope it's been useful to you as it has been for us, and hopefully the start of many more conversations to come over the coming months and years. So,
and Ava and Matt, thank you so much for organizing it. It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to really see what's going on across the world and feeling solidarity in space across great spatial divides. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.